The air was thick with tension, the kind that presses down on the chest and makes every breath feel deliberate. Cameras lined the back of the courtroom, their red lights blinking like watchful eyes. Every seat was filled, not just with lawyers and reporters, but with ordinary Americans who had waited hours just to witness history unfold. This was no ordinary hearing. This was a stage where the future of justice itself seemed to hang in the balance. Jasmine Crockett sat composed, her posture steady, her notes neatly stacked before her. She had been answering questions with precision, weaving facts into a rhythm that commanded attention, and then it happened. A booming voice shattered the air. Donald Trump, unable to contain himself, leaned forward, his tone dripping with disdain. "That's a lie. She doesn't know what she's talking about. Total nonsense." Gasps rippled through the room. The interruption wasn't just rude, it was defiant, a breach of courtroom order that demanded response. The judge slammed the gavel once, then again, the sharp cracks echoing against marble walls. "Mr. Trump, you will remain silent." The command carried authority, but Trump smirked, as if rules were written for everyone else, never for him. For a moment, the entire courtroom froze. Spectators leaned forward, eyes darting between Trump's glare and Jasmine's calm face. Reporters scribbled furiously, aware that this was the moment their headlines would be built upon. And yet Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't roll her eyes, didn't raise her voice. Instead, she let the silence stretch, a silence that was louder than any insult hurled across the chamber. The nation, watching through live feeds and instant updates, held its collective breath. It wasn't just about a man interrupting a woman. It was about power interrupting truth. It was about arrogance colliding with dignity. And in that collision, the spotlight shifted not to the outburst, but to the woman who sat unwavering in its wake. In that instant, America realized this wasn't just a trial, it was a test of dignity itself. But what Jasmine said next would flip the entire courtroom on its head. Why did this moment matter so much? Why did a single interruption in a courtroom feel like an earthquake shaking the nation? Because the trial was never just about evidence or witnesses or legal technicalities. It was about something far greater: whether democracy itself could withstand the weight of arrogance and intimidation. The courtroom became the heart of America that day. Every camera trained on the proceedings wasn't just documenting testimony, it was capturing the pulse of a nation divided. Millions tuned in from living rooms, offices, and cell phones, their eyes locked on a drama that felt less like a trial and more like a reckoning. What played out inside those walls carried echoes of every fight for fairness, every demand for dignity that had shaped the American story. Trump knew this. He thrived on spectacle, on disruption. It built an entire career bending rooms to his will, shouting louder, interrupting faster, drowning out opposition until only his voice remained. And here he was again, leaning on the same weapon, volume. It wasn't about the truth of Jasmine's words. It was about whether truth could even be heard. His strategy was clear: addle her, break her rhythm, make the courtroom bend under the pressure of his presence. But this time was different. The courtroom wasn't just filled with lawyers and judges. It was filled with the unspoken weight of expectation. Americans weren't simply watching, they were measuring.
Oh yeah.
Measuring whether the system they'd been told to trust could actually stand firm. Measuring whether dignity could hold its ground when arrogance tried to bulldoze its way through. Every glance, every scribbled note from reporters carried that awareness. Social feeds buzzed in real time, hashtags forming, clips circulating, commentary exploding. The interruption wasn't just seen, it was felt. The insult wasn't just thrown at Jasmine, it was thrown at every viewer who believed in fairness. And so the stakes grew. This wasn't Trump versus Crockett. This was arrogance versus dignity, noise versus truth, a battle of volume against the power of composure. The silence Jasmine held in the wake of Trump's outburst became deafening because it forced the question: would she break or would she rise? The judge's gavel had restored temporary order, but order was fragile. The weight of anticipation hung heavy, like a thunderstorm waiting to break. The nation leaned forward, some with hope, others with doubt. Could one calm voice really push back against the tidal wave of bluster and intimidation? For Jasmine, the trial was more than personal. She wasn't just defending herself, she was carrying the weight of every story like hers. Every moment when someone tried to be silenced, overlooked, or dismissed. And when Trump's interruption cut through her testimony, it wasn't just an attack on her credibility. It was an attack on every American who had ever been told to sit down and stay quiet. The silence lengthened. The tension thickened. Reporters typed furiously. Commentators whispered predictions, and ordinary people at home waited with breath caught in their throats. The interruption was shocking, yes. But the real story would be Jasmine's answer. Everyone waited for Jasmine's reply, not knowing it would spark a firestorm across the nation. Donald Trump had always carried himself like the rules were written, in pencil, waiting for him to smudge and rewrite them at will. From the gilded towers of Manhattan to the podiums of campaign rallies, his presence was marked by the same rhythm. Louder, bolder, never apologizing. For decades, he had treated every room, whether boardroom, ballroom, or briefing room, as a stage. And now, even in the solemn walls of a courtroom, that same swagger burned through. This wasn't the first time Trump had interrupted proceedings. Court reporters could trace a pattern. He would sneer at lawyers, grumble loudly when evidence was presented, shake his head in exaggerated disbelief whenever testimony cut against him. His voice was not just sound, it was strategy. It's by cutting in, by bulldozing over carefully constructed arguments, he made opponents stumble. By scoffing at judges or belittling prosecutors, he created the illusion that he was bigger than the system designed to hold him accountable, and often it worked. Judges walked a careful line, hesitant to clash too directly with a former president whose name commanded headlines. Opponents faltered, caught off guard by the sheer force of his interruptions. Reporters accustomed to quoting sound bites often framed the exchange around his remarks rather than the arguments he had derailed. Trump understood the game. If you couldn't win by facts, win by volume. If you couldn't dominate through law, dominate through spectacle. For his supporters, these tactics were proof of strength. They saw defiance of protocol as courage, interruptions as authenticity. Each gavel he ignored, each procedural rule he bent, became a rallying cry. He's not like them. He doesn't play their game. What his critics called arrogance, his base celebrated as toughness. What judges scolded as disorder, rallies rebranded as rebellion. But beneath that bravado was something simpler: intimidation. He wielded it like a weapon, locking eyes with witnesses until they stammered, scoffing loudly enough to break their rhythm, looming so large that silence often followed in his wake. Trump didn't need to win arguments when he could bulldoze. Through them, in earlier trials and hearings, the formula had played out again and again. An opponent would begin with fire in their words, only to falter under the weight of his constant disruption. By the end, what remained in the headlines wasn't their testimony, it was his interruption. The story, twisted by volume, always seemed to orbit him. And that was the point. Trump didn't just want to defend himself, he wanted to dominate the narrative. But in this courtroom, the stage was different. Across from him sat Jasmine Crockett. Like many he had faced before, she wasn't flustered by glares. She wasn't baited by mockery. And she wasn't intimidated by the weight of his title. Where others stumbled, she steadied. Where others rushed to speak over him, she let silence work in her favor. Her calmness was not weakness. It was defiance in its purest form. Trump leaned. Unfamiliar tactics that had carried him for years, scoff, the interruption, the dramatic hand gestures meant to steal focus. But as the trial unfolded, something unfamiliar stirred beneath the surface. Unease. For the first time in a long time, his dominance did not land as expected. The gavel fell harder. The audience murmured louder. And Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. He had built his entire persona on the belief that sheer force could bend reality. That if he barked loud enough, if he broke order long enough, truth itself could be reshaped to his will. And time after time, history had rewarded the tactic. But arrogance carries with it a dangerous flaw. It's the assumption that every opponent will react the same way. Trump believed this moment would follow. The script he had written so many times before. He He would interrupt, Jasmine would stumble, and the story would circle back to him. But this time, he underestimated the woman across from him. Long before Jasmine Crockett ever sat across from Donald Trump in a courtroom, she had already fought her way through battles most never saw. She was not born into privilege, not raised with the safety nets that cushion the powerful. Her story began in the modest corners of Dallas, Texas, where opportunity was never handed out, but had to be seized with grit, persistence, and an unshakable belief that her voice mattered, even when the world tried to drown it out. Jasmine's early years were marked by obstacles that might have crushed someone less determined. Growing up, she watched her community wrestle with inequities that others ignored, schools underfunded, jobs scarce, voices overlooked. She saw how justice was not always blind, how the scales tipped depending on the color of your skin or the size of your wallet. These weren't abstract issues. They were realities that shaped her path. Where some would turn bitter, Jasmine turned fierce. She pushed herself relentlessly, working harder, studying longer, refusing to accept that ceilings placed over her by circumstance were permanent. She knew education would be her key, and she treated every textbook, every lecture, as if it were armor she was building piece by piece. Law school wasn't just a goal, it was a mission. She wanted to stand where so many had been silenced and give them a voice. When she entered the legal world, she carried that fire with her. In courtroom after courtroom, she confronted the quiet forms of intimidation that too often defined the process. Lawyers smirking at her youth, judges raising eyebrows at her audacity to challenge precedent, colleagues whispering doubts, their skepticism wrapped in patronizing smiles. And yet, case by case, she carved her reputation as someone who could not be shaken. She spoke with clarity, cross-examined with precision, and wielded facts like a blade honed to perfection. It wasn't easy. Being a black woman in politics and law meant the insults were often double-edged. Some dismissed her for her gender, others for her race, and many for both. She was told to wait her turn, to lower her tone, to accept the invisible boundaries that had kept others in line. But Jasmine had no intention of waiting. Every time she was told to sit down, she stood taller. Every time she was told to quiet her passion, she sharpened her voice into something impossible to ignore. Her rise to Congress was not an accident. It was the result of nights spent knocking on doors, listening to the overlooked, refusing to let cynicism eclipse hope. She didn't just run campaigns, she built movements. Her constituents didn't see her as a distant politician in polished shoes. They saw her as one of their own, someone who carried their struggles into rooms where those struggles were usually forgotten by the time she took her seat in the House of Representatives. Jasmine Crockett was more than just a congresswoman. She was a symbol, a reminder that grit and truth could rise even in a landscape dominated by money, arrogance, and dynasties. She was proof that when someone says you don't belong, the very act of standing firm becomes an act of revolution. And so, when she entered that courtroom with Donald Trump, she did not enter as an underdog trembling before a giant. She entered with the weight of history behind her that countless times she had been interrupted, dismissed, or underestimated, and the countless times she had refused to bend. Trump's outburst, loud as it was not new. She had heard versions of it her entire life, from classrooms where teachers underestimated her, to debates where rivals tried to talk over her, to legislative chambers where male colleagues scoffed at her persistence. That's why her silence in that moment wasn't passive, it was powerful. She had been conditioned, through years of trial by fire, to know the value of patience. She had learned that dignity unsettles arrogance more than shouting ever could. And she had discovered that when the world expects you to shrink holding your ground creates an earthquake. The courtroom may have seen a former president trying to dominate with volume. But Jasmine knew better. She recognized the tactic because she had faced it before, not just in politics, but in life. She wasn't just answering Trump's interruption. She was answering every attempt to silence women, minorities, and truth-tellers who dared to step into spaces where they weren't supposed to belong. And that history prepared her for The moment when Trump tried to cut her off, the gavel had barely quieted the room when Trump leaned forward again, his face flushed, his hands slicing through the air in exaggerated gestures. "This is ridiculous," he barked, his voice booming. Over the microphone, "She's grandstanding. She doesn't even know the law like I do. Total joke." The words dripped with mockery, designed not to challenge facts, but to belittle the person speaking them. He wagged a finger in Jasmine's direction, shaking his head with a dismissive chuckle. The sound wasn't just rooted, it was calculated, a weapon honed over decades to rattle opponents until they stumbled. The judge slammed the gavel once more, sharper this time. "Mr. Trump, you are out of order. If you continue, I will hold you in contempt." But Trump only smirked, leaning back in his chair as if the threat meant nothing. His arms crossed, his posture daring anyone to check his authority. For a split second, it felt like the entire courtroom might collapse under the weight of his defiance. And then came the moment of contrast. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice to compete with his. Instead, she remained still, her pen resting lightly on her notes, her gaze steady. The power of her composure filled the silence in ways his volume could not. The audience felt it. Reporters shifted in their seats, sensing something was about to crack open. A low murmur passed through the gallery, gasps slipping out as people realized what they were witnessing. A woman refusing to be intimidated by the loudest. Man in America social media lit up in real time. Phones buzzed as hashtags formed, posts spread, and live streams caught every smirk, every calm glance, every gavel strike. Clips of Trump's outbursts were already circulating online with captions like, "Here he goes again," and "disrespect in the courtroom." But alongside them came screenshots of Jasmine's unshaken face, her calmness becoming its own statement. Trump, used to control, began to grow restless. He muttered under his breath, tapped his fingers on the desk, his eyes darting between the judge and the congresswoman who refused to be rattled. He was a man accustomed to throwing opponents off balance. But Jasmine didn't stumble. She didn't take the bait. Her silence was louder than his interruption, her steadiness sharper than his mockery. The tension reached a breaking point. The judge, visibly exasperated, warned Trump again to hold his tongue. The room fell into a taut silence, every spectator waiting, every camera trained. Trump smirked as though he had succeeded in stealing the spotlight. But what happened next would prove him wrong. Jasmine lifted her head, her voice calm, but cutting through the tension like a blade. She didn't rush. She didn't stumble. And as the first words left her lips, the entire courtroom seemed to lean forward, and then came the words no one expected her to say. The silence in the courtroom was unlike anything the cameras had captured all day. It was the kind of silence that doesn't come naturally. It has to be earned, ripped out of the chaos by sheer force of will. And Jasmine Crockett had just seized it. Trump leaned back in his chair, smirk curling at the corner of his mouth as if daring her to stumble. He had interrupted her 3 times already. Each time, his tone had grown louder, his gestures wider, his confidence thicker. This was his game, the same one he'd played for decades. Overwhelm, drown out, belittle, but Jasmine didn't flinch. She adjusted the microphone, drew in a slow breath, and locked her gaze on him, not as a rival, not as a celebrity, but as a man who had, for far too long, mistaken volume for victory. The judge's gavel rested on the bench, ready to strike. Again, the reporters' pens hovered above paper. Cameras, red lights glowing, framed every angle. Millions were watching. And Jasmine spoke. Her voice was calm in a way that demanded attention. Not a shout, not a retort, not a scramble. To reclaim space. It was steady, low, measured, the kind of tone that slices sharper than any insult. "Mr. Trump," she began, each syllable deliberate. "This courtroom is not your rally stage. It's not your boardroom. And it is certainly not your personal theater. This is a place where truth is weighed, not shouted down. And for once, you will not control the narrative." Gasps rippled across the rows of spectators. Judge froze mid-motion, as if reconsidering the need for his gavel. Trump's smirk faltered, if only for a fraction of a second. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her words unfolding like arrows aimed with precision. You've spent years interrupting women, silencing critics, mocking immigrants, dismissing the voices of anyone who dared to challenge you. You've convinced yourself that if you're loud enough, you can erase facts, distort reality, and intimidate truth into silence. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled, furiously typing faster than their hands could manage. Phones buzzed into gallery, tweets firing off in real time. Hashtags forming mid-sentence, and then Jasmine delivered the blow that would echo far beyond those walls. But here's the truth you can't interrupt. Dignity will always outlast arrogance. Justice will always outshine chaos. And no matter how many times you try to shout over me, Mr. Trump, you cannot silence the principles that this nation is built on. The room froze. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. Calm, unshaken, like she had been waiting her whole life for this precise moment. She wasn't speaking only to him anymore. She was speaking to every camera lens, every person watching from their living room. Every citizen who had ever felt drowned out by noise louder than reason. Trump shifted in his chair. For the first time, his eyes darted not toward her, but toward the judge, the jury, the gallery, as though searching for some reaction to lean on. His hands, usually animated, tapped the desk in small, restless beats. His shoulders stiffened. The confidence that had once filled the room was thinning, leaking out like air from a balloon. A spectator whispered, barely audible but caught on a hot mic. She shut him down. Jasmine paused, letting silence do the rest. The silence wasn't empty now, it was filled with recognition. Recognition that someone had dared to hold her ground against the storm, and with poise alone shifted the balance. Trump opened his mouth, perhaps to fire back with another insult, but the words stalled. The rhythm was gone, the momentum was gone. For a man who thrived on control, the loss was visible. Jasmine leaned back slightly. A quiet nod to the judge, signaling that she had said all she needed to say. She hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't matched insult for insult. Instead, she had built a fortress of truth so strong that not even the sharpest barb could pierce it. The courtroom was alive with murmurs. Reporters whispered into recorders. Crockett's response dominates headlines. Tweets flooded timelines. Hashtag dignity over arrogance. Hashtag Crockett vs. Trump. Hashtag mic drop moment. The judge cleared his throat, finally speaking. Order, let us proceed. With dignity, but the order had already been restored not by the gavel, but by Jasmine's composure. In the corner, one of Trump's lawyers scribbled a note frantically, glancing nervously at their client. Even they could see it. The narrative had slipped. For once, the interruption game had backfired. And then came the realization. Unspoken but palpable. This wasn't just a courtroom exchange. This was a cultural moment, a turning point. The kind of moment replayed endlessly on cable news, shared in bite-sized clips on social media, analyzed by commentators for weeks. Across the nation, living rooms and office break rooms buzzed. People who had long felt drowned out by bluster saw themselves in Jasmine's poise. People who had grown tired of noise saw hope in her calm. People who had doubted whether truth could still stand tall against chaos found their answer in that single response. And Trump sat back, tapping his fingers harder now, jaw tight. He had miscalculated, that he thought he could bulldoze her like so many before. But this time, the opponent didn't bite. This time, the interruption didn't rattle, it backfired. The cameras zoomed in. Framing the contrast, Trump's tightened jaw against Jasmine's calm smile. It was an image that would splash across front pages and saturate feeds within hours. The mic drop wasn't a single line, it was the totality of her presence. She had turned interruption into exposure, arrogance into weakness, bluster into silence. And as the gavel finally struck, the nation realized something had shifted. The gavel's echo had barely faded when the outside world erupted. Within minutes, hashtags began to streak across Twitter now, like wildfire in a dry field. Hashtag Crockett vs. Trump surged first, then hashtag courtroom clapback. was followed by a flood of variations. Hashtag dignity over arrogance, hashtag she shut him down. What had unfolded in one federal courtroom was now dominating the entire digital landscape. Clips of the exchange, clipped down to 20-second sound bites, were looped endlessly. On one, Jasmine's voice cut through the chaos with her line about dignity outlasting arrogance. That video alone racked up millions of views in hours, retweeted by everyday citizens and verified blue-check power players alike. Another clip, the moment Trump's smirk faltered, went viral as a GIF, captioned simply, "The face of defeat." Cable news networks scrambled to keep pace. CNN opened with the banner, "Crockett stuns Trump in courtroom showdown." Over on MSNBC, commentators called it a watershed moment for women in politics. Even Fox News, usually protective of Trump, struggled to spin it. Their anchors repeated his interruptions, but couldn't ignore the fact that Jasmine's calm had seized the spotlight. And then came the celebrities. A-list actors, musicians, even athletes weighed in. One posted, "Finally, someone who won't back down to bullying. Jasmine Crockett for the win." Another wrote, "She didn't just clap back. She made history." Acting. The tens of thousands, giving the clip a cultural momentum far beyond politics. But it wasn't just famous names. Everyday Americans, from teachers to truck drivers, chimed in. Finally, someone stood their ground. One comment read, another said, "She spoke for all of us who've been talked over, dismissed, shouted down." It wasn't simply about Trump had tapped into a universal frustration. The exhaustion of living in a world where the loudest two often drown out the wisest. Even late-night comedians jumped on the moment. On one show, the host replayed the exchange with slow-motion commentary, calling Jasmine's calm voice the courtroom version of a mic drop. The audience roared with laughter when Trump's reaction appeared, on-screen, jaw clenched, eyes darting. Meanwhile, in Washington, the ripple effects were immediate. Democratic leaders praised her composure, calling it a model of strength under pressure. A few Republicans, off the record, admitted she had outmaneuvered him cleanly. Public opinion polls began to shift overnight. For the first time in weeks, headlines weren't just about Trump dominating the news cycle, they were about someone standing up to him and emerging stronger. Reporters camped outside Jasmine's office, hoping for a comment. Microphones crowded her as she exited the courthouse, but she offered only a brief, composed response. It wasn't about me. It was about the process, the truth, and respect for this institution. That restraint only fueled more admiration. She hadn't made it personal. She had made it principled. The contrast was stark. Trump, usually quick to storm two cameras with fiery rebuttals, left without his usual barrage of sound bites. His lawyers issued a short statement accusing the media of bias, but it fell flat against the tidal wave of viral clips. The narrative was no longer his to control. Inside living rooms across America, families replayed the clip. Some watching in disbelief, others in relief. A grandmother in Ohio told her granddaughter, "That's how you stand tall without shouting." A college student in Texas tweeted, "I didn't think politics could inspire me again until tonight. It wasn't just a political moment. It was a cultural release. A release of pent-up frustration with noise, bullying, and arrogance." Jasmine Crockett had not only answered Trump, she had, in the eyes of many, answered an entire era of shouting matches with one steady voice. And yet, while the internet crowned her the victor, Jasmine herself refused to lean into the hype. She wasn't posting celebratory tweets. She wasn't making rounds on late-night shows. She wasn't basking in the sudden glow of celebrity, because for her, this was never about a viral moment. It was about something far bigger. The noise of headlines, hashtags, and highlight reels could only carry the story so far. What lingered? Part that outlasted the trending cycle was the moral weight of Jasmine Crockett's stand. She refused to let it be reduced to a courtroom skirmish between her and Donald Trump. Again and again, she reframed it, calmly telling reporters this was never about one person interrupting another. It was about the difference between arrogance and dignity. In that simple line, she shifted the ground beneath the debate. No longer was it a spectacle of personalities, it became a parable about values. Arrogance, the kind that tries to silence. Others, by sheer volume, had been exposed for what it was: fragile, desperate noise. Dignity, on the other hand, had stood its ground without shouting, without mocking, without breaking stride. That framing echoed far beyond the courthouse. For immigrants who had been told to go back where you came from, Jasmine's composure spoke of belonging that no insult could erase. For women who had been interrupted in meetings, overshadowed in debates, or dismissed in boardrooms, her steady refusal to be rattled became a symbol of resilience. For ordinary Americans tired of political theater, her focus on truth over ego felt like a breath of air in a suffocating room. Commentators called it a turning point, but the deeper resonance was simpler. Truth always outlasts bluster. Trump's words had been loud, but fleeting. Jasmine's had been calm and unforgettable. Like ripples widening across water, her poise radiated into living rooms, classrooms, and workplaces, reminding people that strength doesn't always look like a raised fist. Sometimes it looks like a steady voice refusing to bend, and that was the lesson people clung to. Not that a congresswoman had scored a win over a former president, but that dignity itself had won over arrogance. The courtroom moment became shorthand. For a universal truth, arrogance burns hot, but burns out. Dignity may burn quieter, but it never dies. The crescendo came not in a roar, but in a silence that followed her words. A silence that carried more weight than all of Trump's interruptions combined. As one journalist put it, in that silence after her words, the whole nation saw what strength really looks like. That silence spoke louder than thunder, and in it, millions of people saw themselves. Donald Trump may have interrupted, trying to drown out the voice of a congresswoman with the same bluster he's used for decades. But in that courtroom, something shifted. Jasmine Crockett's reply didn't just silence a man, it shocked a nation. She reminded America in real time that dignity can outlast arrogance, and that calm truth carries farther than the loudest shout. Her stand wasn't about scoring points or making headlines. It was about showing what strength looks like when tested. And that strength now belongs to everyone who watched, everyone who shared, everyone who felt seen in her courage. So here's the call. Share this story if you believe dignity speaks louder than arrogance. Share it if you've ever been interrupted and wanted the world to know your voice matters too. Let this moment ripple further, till the silence after her words becomes an anthem. And subscribe to this channel if you're ready to stand with voices who won't be silenced. Because this isn't just about one exchange, it's about a movement. A movement that says truth matters, dignity matters. The American spirit is stronger than any insult. As the screen fades, remember, in America, truth doesn't just survive interruptions, it rises above them. And when it rises, it carries all of us with it.